Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights and information, please visit mobilityredefined.com. That is mobilityredefined.com. Welcome to the Mobility Redefined podcast, where we explore governance, strategy, and innovation shaping the future of mobility. I am Dr. Kaan Yildizgoz, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Elodie Hanen, Deputy Director General of Île-de-France Mobilités, the public transport authority responsible for organizing and funding mobility across Paris region. Elodie, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Kaan, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss mobility issues and challenges in the Paris region.
We are looking forward to discuss with you on different topics today and actually learning from the experience of Paris. Let me start with some of my couple of questions about your experience in Paris. And my first question is about governing the mobility at a metropolitan scale. Île-de-France Mobilités manages one of the world's most extensive and dense transport networks. From your perspective, what are the key governance principles that allow such a complex ecosystem to function in a coherent and reliable way?
Thank you, Kaan, for this question and for putting forward the performance and coherence for a public transport system in the Paris region. To me, the key factor to ensure that this very large and complex system, and you mentioned it, we have a lot of RER and commuter rail lanes, we have 15 metro lines, over 1,500 bus routes, even one cable car line since the end of last year. And to ensure that this very complex system delivers efficient public transport for all inhabitants of the region, is the fact that we have only one authority in charge, and that is Île-de-France Mobilités, covering the entire regional territory. And that is a very unique situation in France, partly in Europe. Elsewhere, you have regional authorities in charge of regional trains and municipal authorities in charge of urban public transport, urban buses, trams, metros, when they exist. In the Paris region, Île-de-France Mobilités oversees all these modes, from planification to operational coordination. And we are also in charge of fare policy, which is now uniform across the region for both single tickets and transport passes. And that, I'm sure, ensures a more homogeneous service across the region. And finally, maybe I'd like to point out the fact that we have the composition and representativity of our governing body is very important to ensure that this entire public transport system is designed and operated to meet the different mobility needs within the region. You understand that we don't have the same needs when you are in the very center of Paris and when you are in the outskirts of the region in low density areas. So our board members are elected officials from the regional level to the municipal level for Paris, for instance. And we also have delegates from users association and representatives from the economic sector. We have 2 board members from the regional Paris Île-de-France Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and 1 from the regional employers association. And that means that although Île-de-France Mobilités is the only authority governing public transport, and to some extent mobility in general in the region, this governance ensures that the authority works in a partnership approach with other mobility actors from the ecosystem. And in fact, last point, maybe there is only one PTA, but of course we have a number of PTOs of public transport operators, and they are delivering the service on a large territory. Some of them are operating under a monopolistic condition, but we'll certainly discuss that later in that podcast.
Perfect, Elodie. Thank you for this very comprehensive answer. It was also interesting for me to hear that your close work with the Chamber of Commerce and Employees Association. I was unaware of this because what I was doing very well was in Paris, especially there was a funding scheme via WEG7 de Transport, where you are getting on board the support from the employers as well. And it is this is what I was using as a case in my different talks in different countries, also as a way for funding public transport that's being applied in Paris. And what I want to discuss with you is that there was a massive operational test for the region's mobility system 2 years ago. And it was mainly due to the 24 Olympic and Paralympic Games that Paris hosted. What were the most important lessons learned from operational, strategic, and institutional perspective during while you were hosting the Olympic Games, and what capabilities developed during the Games will remain as part of the long-term legacy in Paris?
Very interesting question also. So if I start with the operational side, I'd like to emphasize the different roles that Île-de-France Mobilités had to play during the Games, and that were roles that we had never endorsed before and that we had to take on because nobody else within the states or the Games organization team or even the public transport operators could take. For example, beyond planification ahead of the Games of the public transport service for all the session and the event in all the different venues with the plan A, B, C up to Z sometimes. During the Games, we had staff at the Games Transport Operations Center, famous truck as we call it, overseeing all the flows of ticket holders to and from the venues, verifying that these flows were aligned with our prediction, and if not, trying to rectify them through adapted public transport itineraries that were returned in our dedicated public transport Paris 2024 application. We had recommended Paris 2024 itineraries. On the operational side also, we had volunteers on site to help direct those flows that I was mentioning. Sometimes they were working alongside with volunteers from transport operators or volunteers from Paris 2024 team, but sometimes they were just on their own on site. For instance, for the dedicated shuttle service that we organized for disabled ticket holders. So that was very operational roles that we played and that we had never played before. You also mentioned the strategic aspect of the role or the game. So on that side, I'd like to mention the travel demand management capability that we had to develop. I already mentioned the fact that we use a dedicated public transport app, the Public Transport Paris 2024 app that we built to direct those flows of ticket holders to the venues through those dedicated itinerary. Those itineraries weren't necessarily the shortest one, but they weren't the ones for which we knew we had enough capacity in the system, in the trains and in the station to absorb all the flows. And that was very important to make sure that everything went well during the Games. That app was built as a twin app of the public transport app that we had launched a few years back. But with that dedicated Paris 2024 application, we were able to isolate the itinerary searches of the game ticket holders and force results with the recommended Paris 2024 itineraries, while the rest of the public transport users, inhabitants or tourists, were sent to other itineraries. And now what's important is that we're using that travel demand management capabilities that we've developed for the Games for other time period, for instance, for summer period, when we have extensive works on our infrastructure that restrain the capacity of the lines. So we are preparing a big deadline in April where we usually present all the work that's planned on the infrastructure for the summer to all the user association, all the journalists. And so we have prepared ahead of that event to make sure that we will provide alternative itinerary using those travel demand capacities. Another example is the use of artificial intelligence for security issue. We were able to implement algorithmic processing for the use case of detecting people going into a prohibited or sensitive area. And that was very relevant for detecting the presence of individual on the tracks, for instance, because when you have individual on the tracks, you have to stop the service, and then it's an incident that creates lots of disruption in the service. So we had to make sure that we have a perfect service and very regular service during the Games. In terms of signage also, following the success of the Pink Games signage, I don't know if you've seen that or if you remember, that was developed for the game. We launched a new approach for signage in our station, starting with the major interchanges station. And finally, maybe on the institutional side, I would like to insist on the coordination role that Île-de-France Mobilités as PTA played, and that role was really reinforced during the Games. Because we have a context here in Île-de-France of market opening of the public transport system. And so in that context, Île-de-France Mobilités has seen its role evolved from a planification organization role to a more operational and coordination role for the entire system. And definitely the games were a major opportunity for us to affirm that leadership over the entire network and the entire ecosystem of mobility in the region.
That was fantastic. It seems that Paris has developed a very comprehensive playbook that can be looked and used by future hosts of major events. And I would like to stay a little bit with these major events and its lasting legacy. I was talking this morning with some of my old contacts, our partners from South Africa, and the discussion was around how the training between the city center of Johannesburg and as well the airport. And this was built for the World Cup mainly, and now it's stayed for the city. And we see this a lot. Major events like Olympics, World Cup, they are often accelerating the infrastructure and coordination efforts. What I wonder is that how is Île-de-France Mobilité ensuring that these investments and coordination achieved for the Olympics translate into permanent improvements for residents and daily commuters of your city?
Very interesting. There's always I would say, a challenge, but also something that the citizens really are keen on. They are very happy to host the games, but want a benefit for them in the long term. So in our public transport sector, the heritage of Paris 2024 Games was not so much new infrastructure, although we did use the deadline of the games to accelerate extension of the metro network, in particular a southern extension of line 14 to Orly Airport in the south, and a northern extension to Saint-Denis-Pleyel that served our national stadium, the Stade de France. But rather, the games were really an opportunity to develop and test enhanced service features for daily users. I already mentioned this dedicated public transport app we used during the games, and that was originally built as a twin of our regular app. That app, of course, Paris 2024 public transport app, was decommissioned after the games, but a lot of the features that had been developed specifically for the games, showing train charge, forced itinerary results, avoiding certain line or certain station, like I mentioned before, they are now part of our app. And I would also say that the modernization and all the efforts that were put into that application for the games lead to the fact that Île-de-France Mobilité application has now become one of the first public transport apps used in Île-de-France by the inhabitants, but also sometimes by the tourists, and it's ahead of City Mapper, for instance. And we also developed the skills in terms of travel demand management. I mentioned that, and that's very much helping us in coping with all the extensive works we have on the network ahead of us, especially because for the games we prepared, but for the summer of 2024, of course, we couldn't have any works on the network, so we have to put more works now in the next year. And we have a lot of investment ahead of us that need, for example, for the arrival of new trains, we have to sometimes work on the networks, and so we have to provide alternative itineraries to our users, and that what we've developed during the games will very much help us to make the network still efficient even under extensive work periods.
Elodie, whenever nowadays I talk with peers from transport authorities, there is no any discussion I conclude without touching the topic of funding and financing. And especially when we look last few years, in particular after COVID-19 crisis, authorities are having a dilemma. That's what I'm saying. In one hand, there is rising expectations from citizens. On the other hand, rising costs and declining funding availabilities. And I wonder, how are you balancing financial sustainability with affordability and service quality in a region where public transport is both a social necessity and an economic backbone?
We are lucky in Île-de-France because we have a very precious funding source, which is called Versement Mobilité. It's a mobility tax that was established in Île-de-France in the region in the 1970s for the development of the public transport system, the RER at the time. This is a payroll tax paid by all the businesses above 11 employees. And this tax accounts for more than 6.6 billion euros of our 14 billion budget, so nearly half. And since Île-de-France is a very dynamic economy within France, we have seen the yield of this tax steadily increase over the years. Even during the COVID, the tax was not so much affected since the state helped businesses stay afloat with loans instead of going bankrupt. So we were able to preserve that resources during the COVID, the sanitary crisis. And we also have important fare revenues. Also, we intend to maintain our fare at relatively low levels compared to other major cities and region in Europe, and for instance, compared to London. And in fact, we have introduced a major fare reform in January 2025 with a flat fare for journeys with metro and trains within the entire region. Another one, which is cheaper for journeys with bus and trams. And since 2023, we have fare increased based on inflation, which we didn't have before. I guess the COVID crisis was also a lesson to make sure that even when the economy is okay, you still have to increase your fare based on inflation, so that maybe you have money on the side for times that are not as glorious, I would say. And just to mention that our budget covered the operational cost of the entire public transport service within the region through contracts with operator, but also a capital program for the maintenance of the network. But fortunately for us, we have other actors putting money into the system. We have the region and the state that deliver grants for new infrastructure projects. For instance, this brand new project, the Grand Paris Express, the 200 kilometers of new automatic metro lines and the 68 new stations. It's not on a budget. It's a dedicated budget. We have also the rail infrastructure manager that covers infrastructure renewal costs. So again, that's not on a budget. So although we always need more money, I would say that compared to other cities or other regions elsewhere in Europe or in the world, we're quite lucky because we have stable financial resources. But I mentioned the Grand Paris Express and those 200 kilometers of new line. When this entire network will be in service in the next decade, financial sustainability would be an issue. And that's why we had to enter in a discussion with the state right before the games, actually, to find new fiscal resources. And now we have a portion of the touristic tax that contributes to our budget. So, but we were not so much affected by the COVID crisis, but I think that we have to prepare because we're extending the network. We have to prepare to be very careful on our resources in the future because, again, extension of the network means also more increased operational cost and later on increased maintenance and cost that we have to prepare for.
Certainly, I see it's very interesting. The West Transport is, for me, a very good example of applying beneficiary pays principle in funding of public transport. And it's very interesting to see it's almost nearly contributing almost half of your budget. And also see the introduction of some contribution from the tourist side. So this is also another example of how the beneficiaries are contributing for the cost of mobility and public transport in the city. When we were talking about funding, you touched a little bit about the inclusivity subject from the perspective of the fare policy. But this inclusivity and equity mobility is an important topic, being discussed from multiple perspectives, including the fare policy, but also in other perspectives. Mobility is not only about infrastructure, but it's about access, equity, and social cohesion. And what does truly inclusive metropolitan mobility look like in practice in Paris from your perspective?
You're absolutely right about the importance of inclusivity in mobility. And we at Île-de-France Mobilités, we've been firmly committed for many years to supporting people either facing economic or social vulnerability, as well as those who are disabled or whose mobility is reduced. So if I look at the first part, I would say the people facing economic or social vulnerability, in terms of fare policy, we offer a very extensive range of social fare options with discounts ranging from 50% up to full exemption, benefiting a large number of priority groups, including, for instance, recipients of social assistance, seniors and retirees, children, youth, students and scholarship holders, people with disabilities, civic volunteers, family with 3 children more. And in total, we have nearly 4 million residents of Île-de-France, more than 30% of the region's population, benefiting from this reduced fare. I also mentioned already the fact that in January 2025, we introduced a major fare policy reform with flat fare within the entire region for single tickets. And for the monthly and annual passes, that reform was already done 10 years ago. We already had a flat fare for the passes for the entire region. When it comes to territorial equity also, the action of Île-de-France Mobilité is not limited to public transportation, because the modal share, which is slightly above 20% at the regional level, remains well below that of private cars, which is nearly 35%. And the car trips mainly take place in the outer suburbs where the car is the dominant mode. So we have option in terms of carpooling, which is an opportunity to improve quality of life and address everyday mobility challenges with a positive impact not only for the users, but also for the community as a whole. And since 2017, Île-de-France Mobilité has promoted and funded a carpooling incentive program, for instance, to support the drivers who open their car doors. So that's showing that we're working on all the different dimensions of territorial equity. In terms of accessibility for people with reduced mobility, we have developed a framework for accessibility and inclusive mobility with the idea that improving the network for people with disability will benefit to all users, and we can all agree on that. Anyone can be in a situation of reduced mobility anytime in his life. Many people today experience difficulties using the public transportation, and those people affected include people with disability, but not only them. We have elderly people, and I just mentioned one number. For instance, we have the people over 65 years old, which represent 25% of the regional population in 10 years in Île-de-France. We have people traveling with strollers or young children. We have pregnant women, and we have travelers with luggage. We host nearly 100 million foreign tourists in France in 2023. So beyond making the station accessible, which requires significant financial investment and can be a very complex and sometimes even impossible from a technical standpoint, it is also important to work on removing barriers to using public transportation for all these occasional and regular travelers, both residents and visitors to Île-de-France. And it includes tourists who need guidance and sometimes arrive with expectation of accessible network from their own countries. And we have a very historic metro here in Paris. And of course, sometimes our tourists come from countries where the infrastructure are more recent. And of course, they're more, I would say, modern or more accessible. And so this is the goal of our approach to inclusive mobility. We aim to develop human support services and digital solutions while continuing to invest to improve and modernize our infrastructure. And we have a major capital program, which is called Schéma Directeur d'Accessibilité, SDA, to ensure accessibility for all users, wheelchair users being the main target of this infrastructure program, in over 300 stations in Île-de-France, and to cover 97% of the RER and train traffic. We've made significant progress on this SDA program in the last 10 years. As just right before the Games, we had 290 stations accessible, covering 96% of the traffic for an objective of 97, as I mentioned. And we have 100% of our tramway lines that are now accessible, and 100% of bus lines within Paris, and most bus routes are outside of Paris. And finally, you mentioned maybe gender and safety consideration. That's a very important issue for us. And Île-de-France Mobilité, through the voice of its chairman of the board, which is also the president of the regional council, Valérie Pécresse, she's very committed against sexual and gender-based violence in the public transport. And that's something that's one of our priority at the moment. It's very important also when we talk about inclusive mobility.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, thank you for being leader in multiple fronts, for putting the inclusive mobility in the agenda, and also being a role model for many other cities. You were talking about upgrades in the metro. I know, if I'm not wrong, your line 1 was put into operation 126 years ago. So doing a major upgrade there would be certainly challenging. And let's go to the end of the podcast, and let me ask you some final questions. And one of the topics that I want to ask you briefly is about digitalization. I don't want to close this discussion without asking you about digitalization. You partially touched this topic when you were talking about Olympics. You talk about AI and so on. But I wonder generally, how is digitalization reshaping passenger experience and operational oversight in the Paris region today?
Yeah, digital transformation is very important for both ticketing and passenger information in terms of passenger experience, I would say. And that, you're right, that's the reason why Île-de-France Mobilités has developed its own application for ticketing and passenger information, the one that we used, or for the one we used for the games. So now we have all our single tickets available on any smartphone via our application or via the Apple Wallet or Google Wallet. We also have a pay-as-you-go pass, Liberté Plus, that's already available on smartphone. And soon we'll have annual and monthly passes again on smartphone. But we were talking right before about inclusive mobility. To be fully inclusive, we must keep physical card and physical distribution, as we all know that some users are less used to digitalization. And we also have digital transformation on the way on a more, I would say, B2C level, as we've developed many digital solutions for the relationship that we have with our public transport operators. And that's especially true in the context that I was mentioning before of opening to tender of the public transport network in the region. We must ensure that this institutional transformation is totally invisible for the users. For instance, on November 1st last year, and again recently on March 1st, we had several new bus operators entering into the system to operate bus routes in place of RATP, the historic monopolistic public transport operator in Paris and in the suburbs. So in order to ensure continuity of service, despite that change of operators due to the opening of the market, we really put intensive effort in ensuring the continuity of service for passenger information ticketing, but also for operational supervision and even, I would say, availability of the service itself. Because, for instance, you have a security feature in a bus that needs to be linked to the central command. And if you don't have that link, if it doesn't work on the IT side, the driver doesn't leave the depot. So we had to make sure on November 1st and on March 1st again that all the buses, all the connection between the bus and the driver and the central command would work. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all the buses on the streets. But that worked perfectly because we had prepared ahead. So I would say that's an example to show that if you manage your risks properly, and especially if you manage the one related to your IT system, digitalization can be a real opportunity to transform the system as a whole, the network, and really improve the service for the users.
Elodie, thank you for sharing your insights on governance, Olympic readiness, inclusivity, and digitalization. So it was a great chat with you. And before we close, maybe, is there any one message you would leave with mobility leaders striving to build systems that are not only efficient, but equitable and resilient?
I would say be confident. Building such a perfect system, efficient, equitable, and resilient, takes time and considerable energy, but it's worth it. As we all know from the deep of our hearts that there will be no desirable future without sustainable mobility.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Elodie, for all this contribution and sharing of your experience from France. I'm sure there are a lot of learning points, action points for our listeners. And I want to thank to our listeners for tuning in again to the Mobility Redefined podcast, and wishing to see all of you again for the next edition of Mobility Redefined.
Thank you. Thank you, Kaan.
Thank you for listening to Mobility Redefined, brought to you by Modaxo. For more insights, visit our website at mobilityredefined.com or follow us on LinkedIn. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite app to stay updated with our latest episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.